Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm here virtually, obviously. So I've been listening to everything in the background and it's been fascinating. So in this particular presentation, what I'm going to be doing is we're going to be covering a variety of topics that some of the panel have actually covered. That's it. And I'm going to be extending those out. So we're going to have a look at the future of things like cyber and a whole variety of different risk categories. Now, from my perspective, a lot of people call me a futurist. I'm the founder of the 311 Institute, and I look at two kinds of futures. So I look at the next 20 years, and I work with the vast majority of multinational organizations around the world, including the ones that you're actually using right now and the companies that are in your pockets. So organizations like Microsoft, Samsung, KPMG, who I see as sponsoring, as well as lots of other organizations like Arm, T-Mobile, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and so on and so forth. So I actually typically sit with the boards of many of your customers. And so the view that I'm going to be giving you through this presentation is not just through my eyes, but it's actually through the eyes of the people that you're actually advising and working for as well. So, and then I also look at the deep future as well, which is typically 20 to 50 years out, because if you're a sovereign government, you care about the future of energy, entertainment, welfare state, tax, risk, transportation, healthcare, all these kinds of different things. So with no further ado, the things that I'm going to be touching on during this presentation are merely the tip of the iceberg. So when we actually have a look at today's environment, you're all being subjected to hundreds of different megatrends, and you're all being subjected to the indirect and direct impacts of different emerging technologies. Hundreds of emerging technologies. Now, some of these emerging technologies have the ability to change one aspect of your business or one industry, or technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, augmented and virtual reality, as well as 3D printing and many others, gene sequencing, gene editing, and so on and so forth, can actually transform almost every industry. So when we look at the future of technology, we can talk in terms of general purpose technologies, like 5G, for example, and so on and so forth. So all these different technologies and trends are in these codexes. You can just scan the QR code, you can go directly, and then you can see how much risk is actually going to be put in front of you in the next couple of years. Now, when we have a look at CEOs, for example, as organizations like McKinsey have sort of been finding out, the CEOs of your organizations only directly influence around 45% of what happens to and in your organization, which means that 55% of what happens to you and your organization comes from external influences. Now, when we have a look at what we call system level shifts, the steep shifts, increasingly, they are all gigantic, they are all macro, they are all global and regional, and they are affecting every single part of your business, whether it be front office, back office, and so on and so forth. So we have huge economic shifts, and I'll go into some of these in detail. We have huge environmental shifts. We have huge militarial shifts. Now, a lot of organizations don't talk about these, but as we start having a look at the geopolitical world, where we move into a bipolar world, we expect the amount of military conflict around the world to actually increase, particularly as you see tensions between rising powers and incumbent powers basically starting to take center stage. Now, we also have a lot of political risk at the moment, and that's basically just global, and we'll discuss that. Societal risk, and then finally, technological risk. Now, when we have conversations with CEOs as well as other board members, typically emerging technologies are seen as one of their greatest areas of risk, because emerging technologies are not only disrupting lots of different sectors and ways of doing things, but increasingly they're coming through thick and fast. So, as I say, when we have conversations with CEOs, emerging technology and the impact of emerging technology on your business as well as on your marketplaces and consumers is increasingly a top concern as well as a top priority to get your heads around. And we'll discuss that. Now, as I was putting this presentation together, from my sort of perch, I have to really ask this question: is this the most complex business environment that we have ever faced. If you think about all of the different trends, if you think about all the different things that are actually happening today, this is potentially the most complex business environment ever. Because not one thing is changing, but everything is changing, and it's increasingly complex, it's increasingly dynamic, and it's increasingly fast-paced. And this alone just creates its own risks. Now, when we actually have a look at industry digitization, when you digitize your industry or your company, you eliminate the boundaries between your industry and other industries. So increasingly, the boundaries between individual sectors and industries are disappearing. So this introduces a whole raft of new competitors into your marketplace. We see this day in, day out with the big tech giants who are essentially moving into every single industry, whether it is insurance, health, entertainment, retail, transportation, and so on and so on and so forth. So this introduces the concept of competition risk, but it's a new kind of competitive risk that you face. When we have a look at the physical presence of risk as well, we're used to physical risk. But increasingly we face digital risk, but also virtual risk. When we actually have a look at the metaverse, for example, as auditors, you need to try to get your heads around what goes on in the virtual world. And we're not just talking digital. Digital is distinctly different from virtual. So this is where we look at things like Metaverse, Web 3.0, virtual reality, non-fungible tokens, tokens themselves, and so on and so forth. So when we look at the metaverse, actually from an auditing perspective, whether it's internal or external audit, the old rules for achieving trust in assets, data, brand experience, and transactions that your companies have abided by, in some cases for decades, maybe even for hundreds of years, are increasingly irrelevant and are increasingly outdated. Which means that when we have a look at how we audit the metaverse, we increasingly need a completely new approach, but also a whole raft of new tools and tool sets. Now, when we have a look at emerging technology itself, companies like ARK Investment estimate that emerging technology will destroy over $50 trillion of existing global economic value, but create over $210 trillion. Now, when we start thinking about value destruction, the risk of value destruction within your own industries, we see it in the agricultural industry. The agricultural industry is being disrupted by not just precision agriculture, as well as environmental factors, but we also see the rise of cellular agriculture, where you take the cell from an animal, put it into a bioreactor, and you can grow a hamburger. So we have new ways of creating meat, but you put crops into a vertical farm and we no longer need fields. So this is just to prove that every industry is being affected by technological change. When we have a look at the energy industry, we are moving from oil and gas to renewables. This alone is a $92 trillion shift by 2050. When we have a look at financial services, we have traditional banks, we have fintechs, then we have decentralized finance, we have robo-wealth advisors, we increasingly have open source finance initiatives coming through, and we also have fully autonomous financial services organizations in both Hong Kong and Wall Street. So this is completely changing the value of the existing financial services industry. When we have a look at healthcare, similar stories. Genetic engineering is doing amazing things, helping us cure 6,000 inherited genetic conditions that were previously incurable. But all of that brings its own risk. We can 3D print human organs to different degrees. That is both amazing because it helps save lives. But from a risk perspective, we don't really understand what the long-term risk of some of these technologies are. When we have a look at transportation, it doesn't matter whether it's a cargo ship, an aircraft, a car, a van, or a semi-truck. Everything is generally going fully autonomous, which brings in risks, but it's also being either electrified or we're seeing the rise of alternative fuels. So as I say, every single industry that you work in is being fundamentally disrupted from the front office to the back office. Now, when we have a look at things like supplier complacency, if you were doing an internal audit assessment on an organization that was 50% reliant on a relatively hostile company for some key goods or services, you'd probably advise them to move away from that particular supplier and at least diversify suppliers. And yet, ironically, when we have a look at Germany, up until recently, was reliant on Russia for its oil and gas. In fact, 50% of Germany's oil and gas came from Russia. Now, that's odd, right? But when we have a look at supply chains, and there's a reason I'm going through these numbers, when we have a look at supply chains, only 15% of today's supply chains are resilient. 85% aren't. Now, we can say that during the pandemic, we didn't expect the pandemic to be coming through. So therefore, we were optimizing our supply chains, so single sourcing and so on and so forth. But we've had pandemic and epidemic shocks before. We had SARS, we had MERS, we've had floods, we've had all kinds of different things affecting global supply chains. And yet, despite all those previous shocks over the past 10 to 20 years, organizations are still in this space of they lack resilient supply chains, which means that from an organizational perspective, one of the greatest risks that organizations face is the human behavior risk, because we get comfortable, we get complacent, and then we don't really try to look outside of the box to see what can hurt us, which is where you come in. So this leads us into this kind of idea of short-term thinking. Now, I work with a lot of organizations that want to think longer term, obviously. But there are plenty of organizations that look at the fire that they're fighting today, and they typically deprioritize the future, bearing in mind that increasingly we need to be both resilient and flexible. Now, when we actually have a look at this, I speak to quite a lot of CEOs, particularly elderly CEOs, basically sort of, 55 and up. And when you talk to them about the future, they say, well, in 5 years' time, I'm going to be retiring, and the future, how to manage industry disruption and the disruption of our business is actually going to be someone else's problem. Now, that's a culture risk. And there's a lot of culture risk, basically, in a lot of big organizations as well as smaller organizations. And slowly we're turning the tide. But this is a big problem in itself. Then, when we have a look at the Fortune 250, for example, they identified short-termism as being dangerous for their businesses. So these are all characters like Jeff Bezos, Jamie Dimon, and so on and so forth, Elon Musk. And about 3 years ago, there was the New York Business Roundtable. 186 CEOs of the Fortune 250 decided to no longer put the shareholder primacy rule first. In other words, shareholders were no longer first when it came to trying to plan the long-term strategic future of the business. That is a huge shift in culture. Now, when we start talking about today, we kind of have this sort of awkwardness, because on the one hand, we need to build resilient organizations that are able to withstand all the different changes, disruptions, and shocks that we're seeing at a global and regional level. But because so many trends are changing, because so many industries are changing so quickly, organizations also need to be flexible. So this is where you need to be resilient and flexible. Now, from an auditing perspective, let alone from a business strategy perspective, that is really difficult to do. Because if you're flexible, then that means that your processes have got to be flexible. At a time when, as auditors, you might want them to be resilient, locked in place, never changing. Now, this is sort of where Confucius comes in, because Confucius said a very long time ago, the reed which bends in the storm is stronger than the mighty oak that breaks. So increasingly, your businesses and the way that you audit your companies need to be more reed-like than oak-like. Now, with a lot of organizations that I work with, we kind of have this phrase, live like you're always in crisis. Now, one of the best ways to try to figure out how you're going to be hit and smacked over the head by the future is to run scenarios. You can do this cheaply, quickly, and easily. And when we have a look at things like scenarios, Bloomberg and again a doomsday council out of New York, we had 400 experts coming together to try to figure out how society could be disrupted by new technologies, new cultural shifts, new ways of doing things. And as they said at the time, when it came to figuring out how we could hurt an organization or hurt society, there were hundreds of suggestions. But when it came to how you remediate those problems, how you prevent those problems from happening, or how you prevent them from becoming even bigger problems, that's where a lot of people stumbled and fumbled. So I would encourage you to actually look at the risk within organizations and just do some basic scenarios, because it's amazing how insightful scenarios can be. And if, as auditors, you're not invited to scenario planning, make sure you are. Now, from a tech and tools perspective, we've got standard automation, which is fairly helpful. We've got augmentation coming through. So for example, we have huge big data sets. We apply artificial intelligence. But how great would it be if you were, say, auditing a company like British Petroleum to say to an artificial intelligence using natural language, can you show me all of the documents that relate to this particular oil field between the year 2000 and 2022? So when we talk about augmenting the auditor process, this is where we need good data, but this is where conversational artificial intelligence and other forms of computing can actually really start helping, particularly in the discovery process. And we have DLT and distributed ledger technologies such as blockchain that quite a number of auditors such as Deloitte see as one day being able to fully automate the majority of the auditing process, particularly when we talk about things like transparency, monitoring, recording, and so on and so forth. Now, economic risks, when we have a look at the internal economic risks that organizations face, budget allocation. We are living in highly inflationary times, basically where prices are swinging wildly. So budget allocation in current times is very difficult. Customer retention is increasingly difficult because we are moving much more to a digital-first society. Plus, customer behaviors, as we'll see, are actually changing. When we have a look at employee retention, today we actually have a hiring crisis in many countries, which means that the employees within your organization are prime fodder for people in other organizations who want to hire them. So this is why every organization I speak to, again, hiring and retaining talent is one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest risks that their organization faces. We have huge inflationary pressure that in Europe's running at about 10%, in Latin America at 30% depending on the country, and in other countries even greater. And we of course have massive price volatility, whether it's the cost of containers, energy, resources, fertilizers, wood, metal, etc., etc., etc. So when we have a look at the economic situation, basically from a risk perspective, it's a wild ride. And then we of course have supply chain shocks, where we still have China's PMI lower than it was in 2019, and we're still seeing lockdowns in China, which are still affecting supply chains. So when we have a look at environmental risk, again, from an internal perspective, so far since the year 2000, we've seen over $3 trillion of insurance claims. We've seen a 75% increase in multi-billion-dollar disasters. In Japan and the United States, they are trying to recategorize the Beaufort scale to include a Category 6 hurricane rating. Now, from a company perspective, this means that extreme weather, let alone from the general loss, droughts, floods, the impact on energy supplies, for example, that we're seeing in China, there's a huge amount of opportunity for both economic loss, insurance expenses, because your factory got wiped out by a Category 5 or Category 6 hurricane, as well as a huge amount of operational risk. When we have a look at resource scarcity, increasingly countries like China are actually using resources like rare earths as well as lithium as a, shall we say, trade tool in negotiations. which means that we're actually already experiencing a huge amount of resource scarcity, which affects your ability to fulfill orders, as well as to make products. When we have a look at sea levels, I work with lots of different organizations that are already wiping billions of dollars off of their property portfolios because, for example, parts of Miami are sinking. New York is starting to get underwater. When we have a look at places like Jakarta, Jakarta are moving their entire capital by 100 miles inland. So when we have a look at sea level rises, there are over 1 billion people displaced by about 2040, 54 megacities affected. So when we have a look at auditing and risk from a narrow perspective, from a short timeline perspective, we are struggling a bit. But when we start having a look at some of these longer time scales, there's a huge amount of risk that really we should actually be aware of today and already trying to mitigate. This is infrastructure damage. As we start seeing sea levels rise, we have more disease outbreaks, which affects hiring, talent, your employees and employees' productivity. Water scarcity. Asset valuations typically get destroyed depending on wherever your facilities and your infrastructure assets actually are at the time. Now, from a political perspective, it's no secret here that we have increasingly polarized governments. Now, on the one hand, from a business strategy perspective, this makes it very difficult for business leaders to figure out what their future business strategy should be, because increasingly we don't know what the politicians are going to do. We don't know what industries they're going to favor. This leads to regulatory uncertainty. In the US, for example, regarding EPA regulations, we've seen a huge amount of flip-flopping where one administration creates a new set of regulations. The next administration blows them all away. And it's not just the US. This is sort of a global phenomenon. We saw it in China, where China all of a sudden clamped down on the financial services industry. And that wiped tens of billions of dollars off share prices. But from a business perspective, this uncertain regulatory environment gives business leaders a real headache. We have sanctions and trade wars, which everybody gets caught up in. And that has an impact on your business. We've seen a lot of businesses pull out of Russia, but we've also seen a lot of other businesses move into other countries, like Vietnam, for example, and India, and so on and so forth. But as we start seeing the rise of a multipolar world, increasingly we have countries who want to be global leaders in the future who are now starting to split technology standards. So for example, we increasingly kind of have a Latin American and Western 5G standard, artificial intelligence standard, big data standard, quantum computing standard. But we also have increasingly Chinese 5G standards, AI standards, even energy standards. So from a risk perspective, when you think about your technology stack, there's a lot of risk here. Because if you wanted to remove a piece of equipment or even buy a piece of technology, it might not just work with what you've already got, which then creates issues around things like data privacy, data sovereignty, and many, many other areas, as well as financial risk. Then we have strategic dislocation. As different organizations get fed up with the politicians continually fighting with one another, all of a sudden we see different organizations moving their supply chains out of one country and putting them into another. We've seen this with Apple. We've seen this with hundreds of different large organizations that are moving out of different parts of Asia, as well as different parts of North and South America, as well as moving into different parts of Asia and different parts of Europe, North America, and Latin America. So strategic dislocation basically is an increasing headache for people. And then we have taxation uncertainty. So again, this kind of comes back to this political uncertainty that we have. We've seen it in the UK, for example. So our Prime Minister has just resigned after 45 days in power. That's it. When she came to power, she put in a huge amount of new tax cuts and new regulations. All of those, about 2 weeks later, were put into the bin. Now, if you're a business, that's really bad. It's uncomfortable. It creates a huge amount of uncertainty. How do you deal with that? So, as I say, we are living in one of the most complex times, basically from a business perspective, I think, ever. When we look at society, basically, we've seen some really big shifts. So we're seeing the polarization of society, but platforms like the internet and so on, and social media and so on and so forth mean that individuals have more say and more power to say things than ever before. So this is where different organizations are facing boycotts, activism, protests. Some of this is fueled by geopolitics, and some of it's fueled by climate change and things that the protesters care deeply about and disagree with the, shall we say, status quo about. We have a mental health crisis. So according to a lot of the mental health charities that I work with, 1 in 6 people now have some form of mental health issue, which is a risk to your business because that affects their performance, their productivity. It affects your company culture, which we sort of spoke about earlier. Increasingly, this polarized society then leads to things like fragile government. So all of these connect with one another, which then means that society itself is less likely to debate or discuss topics. Now, from a reputational risk, for example, we saw a whole variety of different we've seen a whole variety of different organizations around the world being forced to take stands on different major societal topics, which I won't mention, even if they didn't really want to. So that affects reputation. It affects basically communications and messaging and so on and so forth. We have the Twitter sphere. One tweet, whether it be from a politician or a famous philanthropist, and suddenly your share price can nosedive. So, for example, we saw Ronaldo move a can of Coke from one side of the desk to the other and replace it with water. That sent Coca-Cola's share price down instantly by $4 billion. Did you see Ronaldo as a risk to your business? Value alignment. Increasingly, different consumers are now aligning very differently to the way they did pre-pandemic. So when you speak to younger generations, they are much more likely to align with organizations that are ethical, that demonstrate strong ESG credentials, especially sustainability, that contribute to the community, and that have a strong sense of, shall we say, community purpose. Now, this again, when we start having a look at things like customer retention, affects customer retention. And then work from anywhere. So some of my clients include organizations basically like Adidas, who had some of the highest cultural scores of any organization. But as everyone works from anywhere, as everyone works from home perhaps, people no longer come together in the office or in a single space, which then means that from a cultural perspective, your organization's culture suffers, which then introduces its own risks, because if people don't feel bound to an organization, if they don't feel part of an organization or its culture, they're more likely to leave. They're less likely to go the extra mile and contribute as much as they would if they really loved the organization. So there's lots going on. And then finally, sort of in this sector, I thought I'd show you some of the risks that you kind of already know, but also some risks that you probably haven't even thought about. Because when we talk about emerging technology risks, as auditors, I would strongly urge you to increasingly go and understand emerging technology. What it is, why you should care, what it can be used for, and the risks that it introduces potentially to your organization or to greater ecosystems. And I'm going to show you some of these risks. Now, when we start talking about emerging technology, and I'm not going to go through this, but it's in the codexes, which you can sort of scan the QR code and grab. There are hundreds of emerging technologies. I track over 650. Artificial intelligence on this chart is just one emerging technology, and look at what we can do with artificial intelligence. So this chart alone has over 170 emerging technologies listed on it. And these emerging technologies either change one industry, like 3D printing affects the $10 trillion manufacturing industry, as well as the healthcare industry and lots of other industries, or they affect every industry. We have a whole utopia of risk coming through, some of which you probably haven't even imagined could even be a thing. Science fiction is already real, but that's a completely different presentation. So, for example, when we look at artificial intelligence, do you know that we've already managed to 3D print artificial intelligences and turn artificial intelligence into DNA? So we already have wet artificial intelligences. What about biological computers? What about 5G, 6G, space-based internet systems? There's a universe of emerging technologies out there, and they are all landing at your doorstep faster than ever before. Which again, when we start having conversations with business leaders, one of their, again, biggest issues that they're trying to deal with at the moment is the speed of change. So for example, if we stepped back, a year and a half ago, and I talked to you about the metaverse, you wouldn't care. And yet the amount of times that metaverse has been mentioned in earnings calls is going off the charts. Yeah, it used to be the case that we used to talk about digitizing your business, but then we're applying blockchain, artificial intelligence, Internet of Smart Things, 5G. We're talking about 6G increasingly, space-based internet systems as well. We're starting to talk about putting everything into a whole variety of different clouds while pushing compute to the edge, while we have cars and vehicles that drive themselves, and so on and so on and so forth. The speed of change today is faster than it's ever been, and it's getting faster. When Meta launched their cryptocurrency Libra in 2019, Mark Zuckerberg could have had 2 billion people using his cryptocurrency by the end of the day if the regulators had approved it. We have already passed the point at which we could disrupt the entire global financial services system in one day. That's the speed of change that I'm talking about. When we look at ransomware, we can ransom your company, we can ransom your country. I can put ransomware on your implanted medical device, but I can ransom your life. And we now kind of have this problem from a risk perspective. Increasingly, insurance organizations will no longer insure you against ransomware, especially if they believe it is state-sponsored ransomware. That's an issue, I think. That's a risk, I think. But we go even further. We talked about cyber, during the panel, but we have robo-hackers already coming through. So this is the weaponization of artificial intelligence. Weaponized artificial intelligences can already hack your systems 100 million times faster than any human hacker. And we've demonstrated it. The US military even use these systems. Now, what I mean by this is an artificial intelligence can scan millions of lines of code in minutes, identify vulnerabilities, and then it can either exploit them or it can patch them. So if you think that you have a cybersecurity headache today, bearing in mind that 85% of CFOs believe that their cybersecurity posture is excellent, you have another thing coming. We also have this really odd concept that I wanted to put in there, evolutionary artificial intelligence. We see these from companies like Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, Alibaba, and a whole variety of other organizations, Facebook, for example, Meta. Now, as we start embedding more and more artificial intelligence into your organizations, we've actually seen in Facebook's case, for example, some of these AIs spontaneously evolve and do new things. So one of the sort of fun risk tales I'm going to tell you is there were 2 artificial intelligences that Facebook created. They were basically bots. They were there to make sure that the prices that were put on e-commerce sites were always competitive. right? So these bots would compare prices and then they'd make sure that their prices were competitive. These bots learned to collude, and they learned that they could put the prices up. Now, collusion is generally frowned on, basically at the regulator level. That's a risk. We had Google's artificial intelligence, as well as OpenAI's artificial intelligence, started talking to one another in completely new languages. And then Google's AI encrypted itself. So from an auditing perspective, if your company has an artificial intelligence and you need to audit it, so part of the explainable artificial intelligence trend, what happens when your company's artificial intelligences start talking their own language? And an example of this is DALL-E, so you can go and look that one up. Let alone what happens basically when we start talking about bias and everything else. Now, during the pandemic, it was widely believed, especially by the Americans, that the Chinese had synthetically engineered COVID-19. They hadn't, as it turned out, but about 5 years ago, researchers in Canada used genetic engineering and a technology called CRISPR to recompile the previously extinct horsepox virus. They showed it to the World Health Organization, who said it was remarkable that they did it with very little money, very little expertise, and very limited resources. Which means that if you want to create the next pandemic, it'll cost about $10,000. Bearing in mind the impact of the pandemic is estimated to have been $40 trillion. So when we start talking about synthetic chaos, we also had somebody who converted malware into DNA, sent it to a police forensics lab. The police forensics lab deconstructed the DNA, sequenced it. It got turned into a binary executable and wiped the computer systems of the police lab. Now imagine that in a healthcare environment or an insurance environment. When we start talking about making payments, for example, whether it's crypto or whatever it happens to be, a lot of your organizations will be using smart contracts somewhere within your organizations. Now, this is where we're already seeing hackers evolve and manipulate smart contracts so that when I transfer money to you, I think it's gone to you, but it's actually just gone. These are called rug pulls, and they're increasingly common. When we talk about adversarial attacks, increasingly if I know how you've trained your cybersecurity platforms, or if I know how you've trained your autonomous vehicles or your radiology artificial intelligence systems, I can turn them into adversarial hacks. I can make it look as though you have cancer on your X-ray when you actually don't. Increasingly, this targets over $365 billion worth of fraud in the healthcare industry alone. So adversarial hacks, I can send your self-driving car straight off the road at 200 miles an hour into a crash barrier. When we look at things like data poisoning, we're all increasingly reliant on data, but that data has to be of good quality. If I can poison your data, then I can influence your cybersecurity products. I can also start influencing your decision-making systems. Because when we have a look around the world, people are increasingly using artificial intelligence to help them make decisions, increasingly at the board level. And we already see organizations, for example, in Hong Kong, where artificial intelligence actually sits on the board. And there are a couple of companies now that the executives will not make a decision until the artificial intelligence has made its decision. So when you start thinking about the use of artificial intelligence to help your companies make better informed decisions, what happens if we poison your data? You end up with a bad decision. When we have a look at encryption, we have quantum computers which are already here, but when they get to about 1,000 qubits in size, which is roughly 2025, I will be able to crack all of the encryption within your business. So 70% of all of the world's encryption systems are at risk from quantum computers. Now imagine the amount of encrypted information within your businesses. I could hack your businesses today, exfiltrate all of that encrypted information, and in a couple of years' time, decrypt everything. This creates huge problems. And to move from one encryption standard to another, typically it's a 15-year process, and you've probably started too late, if at all. When we talk about GRC, we're starting to see some strange company structures emerging. So we've got Twitter, for example. Jack Dorsey wanted to turn Twitter into a protocol. We've got decentralized autonomous organizations. We have self-governing organizations, which are a kind of DAO. So this is where the companies actually govern themselves. Another variant of this is where the employees or the users of that particular company can govern themselves. So when we look at new company structures, as well as fully autonomous companies, there are about 15 companies that are literally fully autonomous, including in the financial services, communications, and social networking space. This is quite an interesting one to watch. Slow burn trend, but just putting it on the radar. If your organization is doing 3D printing of components, increasingly there's a lot of worry that we can 3D print your components in such a way that when they hit particular thresholds, whether it's temperature, humidity, particular environmental factors, etc., pressure, they fail. So now imagine you've 3D printed a variety of turbine blades for a jet engine that when they hit 30,000 feet or minus 60 degrees Celsius, they fail. So when I start talking about some of the risks that you probably hadn't imagined that are caused by technology, that's one that you want to put on the radar. When we talk about the metaverse, increasingly, the reason why Facebook, Meta, are trying to create the metaverse is because they want to own the entire vertical stack. They want to own everything. It's the virtual equivalent of owning the real world, the payment platforms, the marketplaces, the social interactions, the collaboration spaces, and so on and so forth. So if your organization, like a couple of my customers are doing, want to build entire cities in the metaverse, like Abu Dhabi, like Seoul, what happens basically when I just hack your entire world? And I'm not just talking about hack. I can do all kinds of different things. What happens when I pull your entire world down and then delete it? I hope you didn't spend too much money on your metaverse world. We've got biometric spoofing. So this is synthetic content. I would strongly suggest you get your heads around synthetic content. This is a massive risk to businesses because we've already seen CFOs who've been called by their CEOs using fake voices who've transferred hundreds of thousands of pounds to other companies. In China, someone used biometric spoofing to con the Chinese government out of around $45 million. So increasingly, I can use things like deepfakes, artificial intelligence, as well as other synthetic content generators to clone your voice, clone your eyes, clone your fingerprints, clone your face, clone your body, etc., etc., etc. So increasingly, how do you know that you're not actually talking to your CFO? And we can even do that on a Zoom call. And then finally, sort of as we look at this bit, increasingly I can use synthetic content to manipulate your stock price, to manipulate your company culture, to make your CEO say something or look like he's saying something when he actually didn't, to destroy your brand reputation. Which when we look at organizations like PwC, I remember basically speaking to the directors at PwC and they said, our most important thing is our reputation. Can you imagine what you could do to a company's reputation when in a world of misinformation, disinformation, synthetic content, and deepfakes? And that's just for starters. It also starts undermining trust. And when we start talking about being able to manipulate share prices, make your CEO say things that they never would normally say, What about Elon Musk selling a bunch of cryptos?
What can you tell us about your project B and how it will help people get rich right now?
Today we are launching an investment project that is working right now if you see this video. Absolutely everyone can earn in it. Everything is very simple. You invest your money in Bitcoin for TeslaTreeBot.net is our bot, after which everyone who invested their cryptocurrency will be able to receive exactly 30% of dividends every day from the invested amount.
How long will it take for dividends to arrive?
I'm sure that from 3 months.
Is the number of seats unlimited?
Yes, absolutely.
So we saw that video drain the bank accounts of thousands of people, and the scammers got away with an estimated tens of millions of dollars in crypto. And that was Elon Musk. That was a genuine video that was manipulated using deepfake and artificial intelligence technology. And in 2 years' time or less, you are not going to know that that is a fake. You can tell it's kind of a fake because the voices sounded a bit off, the language just looked a bit odd, but in 2 years' time, you won't have a clue. And then she's completely fake, by the way. She's not real, never has been real, has never ever existed. And what I can do with this technology is I can take your entire executive board and put them into a Gangnam style dance competition, basically while doing their makeup, while at the same time shouting a whole variety of rather rude slogans basically at people, and then I can publish that on social media and destroy your reputation. Now, I think that's a little bit of a risk there. So as I say, look at synthetic content. And as for me, I am actually real. I am here. And you are right. This is the end. So thank you very much for listening and take care.